I remember that moment so vividly, as if it happened just now, even though I was only 10 at the time. The sky was covered with dense clouds, through which the sun's rays barely broke through, and the alley seemed deserted and damp despite it being the height of summer. Mom froze by the window in the dining room, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number on the phone, and I settled on the carpet, hugging my knees tightly, feeling the approaching trouble. At that moment, I didn't yet realize that this was the last chance to see my father. Father disappeared without a scandal, without farewell words like a shadow. He just said, "I need space to figure myself out," and left, leaving us in an oppressive silence that turned into a tangible heaviness after his departure. I tried to understand. Why? What was my fault? Mom ignored my questions, and her silent sobs spoke more eloquently than any explanations. Before our apartment rang with joy. Father joked masterfully, and his laughter echoed through all the corners. Even passers-by could hear our fun. He took me on walks in the forest every summer, showed me how to hammer screws, even though he himself was a lousy handyman. But suddenly everything evaporated, and this disappearance became my first lesson in life. Loved ones can leave you, and their absence creates a vacuum that nothing can fill. I tried to mask the suffering. Classmates weren't interested in your soul. They just mocked and ridiculed any vulnerability. Sometimes I believed that if I became strong, if I played the role of a mature guy, Father would appear one day. But he didn't show up. And as I grew up, I realized more clearly that his departure was irreversible. Mom worked around the clock to support us. She was like a cliff, unshakable, resilient, but in solitude, I noticed her exhaustion, her anxiety, her hidden torment. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night and saw her sitting in the living room, hugging her knees, silently crying. Then I quietly sneaked up and sat nearby, and we sat in silence, because words seemed too deafening for the abyss that Father had created. Childhood without a father is a strange feeling. On one hand, you long for his return, for him to assure you that everything will be okay. On the other, resentment arises. Resentment toward the one who could have been your idol but vanished. I searched for excuses. Maybe he burned out, maybe he had his own difficulties, but nothing excuses the fact that he just ran away, ruining 10 years of my life. I remember my first nightmares after his departure. I woke up from an inner scream, from a feeling of abandonment. In those dreams, Father loomed in the doorway, but as soon as I rushed to him, he melted into emptiness. I screamed, shed tears, tried to make sense of what was happening. But I woke up alone with a wet pillow and emptiness in my soul. School turned into an ordeal. Peers didn't understand why I was so nervous, why I sometimes ignored questions, why I often slipped away to the bathroom to hide my sobs. Teachers told Mom that I was too detached and that I needed help, but no one could support me like Father could have. Sometimes I fantasized about his return. I sat on a bench near the entrance and stared at the path, waiting for his silhouette. I made up scenarios in my mind, how he would come in, apologize, hug me. I knew all his habits, all his favorite phrases, and every time I heard something similar to his tone, my heart froze with excitement and bitterness at once. Mom tried to explain it in her own way. Sometimes adults make mistakes. He had to leave to sort out his feelings. But it seemed absurd to me. I didn't need self-analysis. I needed a father. I needed the one who taught me to ride a scooter, who showed me how to screw in bolts, who teased me when I fell but then picked me up with a smile. We tried to move forward. I started a notebook where I wrote down my thoughts, grievances, dreams. There were sketches where I imagined Father returning, and we would go hiking again, laugh, joke. This notebook became my secret world where I could be honest with myself, where no one disappeared without a word. Time passed, but the vacuum remained. Sometimes I watched other kids with their fathers, and a quiet jealousy awakened in me. I saw how they played together, how Dad encouraged his son, how he guided and cared. And then I got angrier at my father because I never had that. But paradoxically, this torment shaped me. I learned independence earlier than my peers. I understood the value of connections, the importance of someone's presence in your life. And although deep down I despised his departure, I realized that it was this loss that made me who I am. And yet, every time I heard someone's voice remotely resembling his, or noticed a gentleman of my build with a similar posture, my heart clenched. I thought, maybe it's him, maybe this is a chance to fix everything. But the expectation quickly faded because years confirmed, Father won't return. Adolescence, it hit me like a storm and instantly found all my old scars. I was no longer a child who just sat on a bench hoping to see Dad. Now I had become a young man with rage, confusion, and fear of the future. The world around suddenly became more complicated, and the abyss left after father's departure turned into a black funnel, swallowing any joy. School in those years was like hell. The guys noticed my detachment and started bullying. You don't have a dad, you don't have a normal family. At first, I kept silent, trying not to give in, but with each jab, my rage accumulated. I wanted to roar, fight, just prove to the world that I exist and that I'm not broken. But no one noticed the hurricane raging inside me. I started searching for father. At first, these were naive efforts, sending letters to the old address, calling old numbers, asking neighbors. But each time I was met with indifferent responses or silence. Then I began to understand that his departure wasn't a temporary measure, it was forever. And that idea burned in my chest like a red-hot blade. Mom tried to support me, but she herself lacked strength. She worked almost non-stop so we could live decently. Sometimes she tried to talk to me about emotions, but I just pushed her away. "You don't know," I yelled, although she knew much more than I thought. I despised her for her tears, for looking fragile. I despised myself for not being able to let go of the resentment. In school, I made my first friends, but relationships with them were complicated. I trusted sparingly because inside was the thought, everyone leaves, everyone betrays. Any consolation seemed fake because I lacked a model of real, stable attachment from father. I learned to hide feelings, but rage broke through in petty skirmishes, fights during breaks, sarcastic remarks, and alienation. Sometimes I tried to understand why father ran away. Maybe he was afraid of responsibilities. Maybe he just wasn't mature. But these thoughts only fueled my anger. I imagined him living somewhere far away, going about his routine without remembering us. Each vision was a blow to the soul. I started despising him even more sharply, but along with the contempt grew a tiny particle of faith. What if he was just waiting for the right time to appear? In my teenage years, I began noticing unusual traits in myself. I reacted too sharply to any mentions of families where the father was around. At school meetings, when peers shared stories of outings with their dads, my chest tightened. Sometimes I went to the bathroom to avoid crying because tears were seen as weakness and I didn't allow weakness. I continued writing in the notebook. It contained rage, bitterness, riddles without answers. I described everything that tormented me, about mom, about friends, about myself. There I could be frank because the notebook would never let me down, never leave. Sometimes I flipped through the early pages, and each line reminded me that father disappeared exactly at the moment when I was too young to understand and let go. One of the hardest episodes was my 14th birthday. All the kids gathered with their parents, received gifts, exchanged laughter. And I sat at the table with mom, clutching a modest present we bought together, and thought about how it would have been if father showed up. I imagined his smile, his hands, his tone. But instead, there was only my hidden anger and tears that I tried to hide. The first attempt to find father in reality happened by chance. I learned from a classmate that he saw a gentleman resembling my father at the market. My heart pounded. I rushed there after school, searched every corner, asked vendors, but no one knew anything. Returning home, I cried. It was a combination of faith and hopelessness, to believe and realize that the chances are almost zero. In adolescence, I began to perceive reality differently. People around were creating their own social cells, acquiring new traditions, and I was still living with those 10 years that father took from me. I despised him, but the contempt had already integrated into me. It shaped my worldview, my approach to people. Attachment seemed like vulnerability, closeness, a threat. I started looking for a replacement for father in other men, teachers, neighbors, relatives, acquaintances. But no one could replace the one who ran away. Sometimes I felt betrayal because the world seemed unfair. Why did he leave? Why should I suffer while others get what they're meant to? These riddles gnawed at me daily, and the answers were as cold as his departure. At that stage, I first encountered the internal conflict between the desire to find father and the wish to hate him. Sometimes I thought, if I find him, I'll crush him with words, I'll ask why he left us. At another moment, I dreamed of him just appearing and saying, I was wrong, sorry. These two pictures fought within me, and I learned that no matter the outcome, I would never return to the old me. By the end of adolescence, I became more detached but stronger. The rage transformed into hidden resilience. I had to endure, I had to learn maturity without his help. I became more attentive to mom, although it often expressed itself in remarks and reproaches. I learned to understand people through the filter of father's absence, who can stay by your side, who is prone to betrayal. And yet inside me a particle lingered, a particle of faith that one day I would meet him, that someday I could ask all the riddles, that one day I would find out why he left. This faith was like a dim light in the darkness, tiny but alive. I clung to it, because otherwise my life could turn into a bottomless and endlessly dark abyss. And it was this particle that became the foundation for what was to happen 20 years later. The particle that quietly lived inside a young man with rage turned into the resilience of a mature individual, ready to face the past face to face. Youth is a mysterious period. You're no longer a child, but not yet an adult. Chaos boils within you. At the same time, you're drawn to love, to believe, and you fear being betrayed again. For me, this interval became the time when I began to realize that father's absence left a mark not only in childhood, but in everything I did, dreamed about, how I attached myself, and how I became a person. After finishing school, I entered university, and this became my first experience of living without constant parental supervision. I lived independently, and independence was both bliss and horror. Independence meant that now I had to make decisions myself, pave the path, and be responsible for mistakes. Sometimes I envied friends whose fathers were nearby, not just a silhouette in the past, but a real mentor. And I had only a notebook, ancient memories, and the vacuum left by his departure. I studied economics. For me, it was like searching for balance in a world where I myself experienced imbalance in the form of an absent father. Economic models, market analyses, trend breakdowns, all this seemed to me a way to understand why people leave, betray. Inside me grew determination. I won't let anyone ruin my life like my childhood faith in father was ruined. Relationships with people were complicated. I strove to build friendships but always kept a distance. Attachment seemed risky. I watched how my comrades argued with their parents, how their families supported each other, and felt that I lacked this. Sometimes I tried to tell them about my father, but the words stuck in my throat. It was scary to voice what left such emptiness, because every time I did, I felt like a kid again, betrayed by his idol. The first passion came suddenly. She was bright, sincere, with eyes shining with warmth. I was afraid to open up to her fully. I was afraid that passion would become a source of torment like it happened with father. But with each day, I learned to trust, learned to be myself. Sometimes I imagined that in her gaze I saw what I didn't see in father: stability, care, a chance to be loved. Nevertheless, the shadow of the past always hovered over me. Sometimes I recalled how father left, how mom cried at night, how I sobbed from powerlessness. These images were a heavy burden that I dragged behind me, but over time I began to transform it into experience, into understanding. I can't change the past, but I can shape my future. At university, I got close to people who became an alternative family for me. We studied together, shared experiences, supported each other. I began to understand that care and sensitivity don't always come from blood relatives. Sometimes they come from friends, mentors, random people who decide to stay in your life. This lesson became a key step in my youth. The world isn't limited to family, and attachment can be diverse. I started working part-time to help mom and support myself. The work was exhausting, sometimes draining, but it gave a sense of control and self-sufficiency. I learned that no one would come and fix my mistakes. No one would be my support like father could have been. This fact was painful, but it tempered my character. I learned to rely on myself, value efforts, see how attachment manifests in caring for loved ones. Youth also brought me the first serious arguments with father in my imagination. I often pictured a conversation with him, asking riddles, pouring out bitterness, yelling at him for the years he took away. These dreams were my way to confront internal torment. Sometimes they seemed more painful than reality, because in them I could say everything that was impossible to voice in real life. Gradually, I began noticing changes within myself. The rage became less sharp. It turned into quiet vigilance. I learned to judge people by their actions, not promises. I began to realize that attachment and care aren't abstract ideas but concrete steps shown day by day. And although I didn't get this from father, I could choose how to show it myself. In this period, I first began to think about forgiveness. Not forgiveness for his sake, but forgiveness for myself. I learned that hatred destroys more than absence. I wrote in the notebook, "I won't let you go because I'm afraid, but I want to stop being a prisoner of the past." This moment became a turning point. I began to learn release, although I didn't yet know that one day meeting father would be the real test of this ability. Youth taught me a lot: self-sufficiency, the importance of companionship, resilience to torment, and self-understanding. It showed that life continues even if one of the key people left. It shaped me as a person who can attach, believe, and confront. And yet deep in my soul, a quiet, almost invisible faith lived. Someday I would meet him. Maybe he would be different, maybe everything would turn out differently. But this faith was an important part of me. It didn't let me break. It kept the spark of trust in the possibility of a meeting, in the possibility of asking the riddles I'd been searching for answers to for so long. And it was this faith, accumulated through years of torment, rage, and autonomy, that became the foundation for what was to happen 20 years later. It was a quiet but powerful energy that guided me through youth, through all mistakes and trials, and prepared me for the moment when I would finally meet the person who once left my life. I never imagined that this moment would come so suddenly. 20 years had passed since I last saw Father. 20 years full of riddles, bitterness, expectations, and fears. And here I was standing on the avenue, trembling with uncertainty, clutching a small envelope with his message, a message he sent just a week ago. The message had only a few lines. I realize I left too early. I realize I caused you torment. I don't ask for forgiveness if it means nothing to you, but I would like to meet and try to explain. I reread the message multiple times, trying to sort out my emotions. Horror, rage, curiosity, and strangely, relief. Finally, he took the initiative. Finally, I could see who he had become now after all these years. The meeting was scheduled at a cozy bistro on the outskirts of the city. I arrived first. I sat at a table by the window, clenching my fists. My heart pounded as if trying to escape. Every minute of waiting, I pictured his appearance, what he would look like, how he had changed, what his expression would be. And each idea generated new turbulent feelings, anger, anticipation, horror, and a strange faith. When he stepped inside, time seemed to freeze. I saw a man of average build with tired eyes and a slightly stooped figure. Outwardly, he was almost the same as I remembered, but the years had left their mark. My soul trembled, and with it came a storm of sensations. I wanted to run away, roar, pounce on him, and reproach, but at the same time, I wanted to just sit and watch. He noticed me, froze, as if making sure it was really me. His lips trembled, his gaze filled with uncertainty and sadness. He approached and sat opposite cautiously, as if afraid I might tear him to pieces. "Hello," he said quietly, and this greeting sounded so strange and distant. I kept silent, gathering words. For many years I rehearsed this moment in my mind, practiced what I would say, how I would behave, how I would pour out all the torment accumulated over these 20 years. But reality turned out different. Everything seemed too grand, too tangible. He began but fell silent, swallowing words. "I realize I left and caused you torment. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to explain." I felt two halves colliding inside me. One voice screams, "I despise." The other, "I want to understand." I wanted to roar, reproach, splash out all the torment I'd hidden for so many years. But instead, I just straightened up, took a deep breath, and said, "Why?" That was the only word that escaped my lips. Not forgive, not where have you been, but simply why. He bowed his head, gathered strength, and began to tell. The story I heard was complicated and heavy. He spoke about his fears, about depression, about how he didn't know how to cope with the burden, about how he was afraid to ruin my life with his presence. He spoke for a long time with pauses, choking on feelings he had held back all these years. Each of his words was like a blow, both striking and healing. I heard excuses, but not excuses. I heard a person who was once dear to me and now stood before me, vulnerable, open, and real. "I don't want you to forgive me if you can't. I just want you to understand," he said. I listened, sometimes interrupting, sometimes silently nodding. Sometimes I wanted to run away because the torment was almost physical, as if old scars had reopened. Sometimes I wanted to roar, "Why weren't you there when I needed you so much?" But I kept silent, because for the first time in many years, I realized that anger wouldn't give me answers. The answers were in the words I'd been waiting for so long. We talked for several hours. He shared his life, about how he erred, about work, about other people, about the fear of being a lousy parent. I shared about myself, about how his departure affected me, how it shaped my growing up, how I tried to endure without him. Sometimes our speeches overlapped, sometimes we fell silent. In those silent moments, I felt his presence for the first time, not as a vacuum, but as a person who was here and now. He asked for forgiveness multiple times, but I couldn't respond immediately. Forgiveness isn't an instant gesture. It's a process built over years of torment, reflections, and realizations. I told him, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I want to understand." These words became the beginning of a new chapter. We realized that the meeting wouldn't fix 20 years, but it gave a chance for understanding, for exchange, for the possibility to rebuild connections. We discussed childhood, Mom, events that happened without us but left a mark in our lives. At some point, I noticed my eyes moistening, not with tears of torment but with tears of release. I felt that part of the burden I'd carried all these years was finally starting to recede. And it was strange, because along with the tears came a mixture of sensations: anger, sadness, relief, faith. He looked at me with the same mixture of sensations. And in that moment, I realized that sitting before me was not the person who left 20 years ago. Before me sat a mature man who had erred, suffered, tried to find strength to live, and now sat here, open and sincere. "I want to be around if you'll allow it," he said. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt that I could choose. Choose communication, choose trust, though gradually, cautiously, step by step. I realized that it wouldn't be easy, that old scars would still ache, but for the first time in a long time, I saw a possibility. A possibility to build connections that wouldn't destroy me but help understand who we have become now, after years of separation. We left the bistro together. I still kept my distance, still didn't know where this path led. But inside me, something had changed. I felt that for the first time I could breathe deeply, that for the first time after many years I could look at the person who caused me torment and see before me a chance for exchange. This meeting became the beginning of everything. The beginning of conversations, the beginning of understanding, the beginning of rethinking the past. And although there were still trials ahead, still moments of doubt and torment, this day will forever remain in my memory as the day when I met him again, and for the first time felt that I could be ready for the future. Several days passed after the meeting with Father, but the world around me had already changed. Everything seemed unusually quiet and at the same time resonant. I sat on the terrace of my apartment, looked at the city, and thought about what had just happened. 20 years of torment, bitterness, and confusion suddenly appeared before me in the form of a person who now seemed almost a stranger but still remained the one who was once my support. Inside me, conflict boiled. On one hand, I felt enormous anger. Why did he leave? Why did he leave me alone? Why did Mom suffer? On the other, I felt curiosity and a desire to understand. Who has he become? What has he gone through? Why did he decide to appear? These contradictions swung me from side to side, forcing me to revisit every episode of my life, every detail where his absence was felt most sharply. I began returning to images. I recalled childhood episodes, how he taught me to ride a scooter, how we built a shelter in the garden together, how he laughed when I stumbled. Each memory was both bliss and torment. Bliss from the fact that he was once around, and torment from the fact that he left, leaving a vacuum. Understanding came gradually. I began to realize that his departure was the mistake of a person who himself fought with his fears and weaknesses. This isn't an excuse, but an explanation. And the more I thought, the clearer it became. The anger and bitterness I'd carried all these years prevented me from living fully. They made me vigilant, detached, distrustful of people I loved. I resumed writing in the notebook, but now differently. Before, these were just records of torment and anger. Now these were efforts to understand. I described everything I heard, felt, realized. I described childhood, teenage anger, youth, first mistakes, first sensations of attachment and trust. I described the meeting with Father and how his words affected me, how I tried to hold back tears, and how for the first time I felt the possibility to let go. Forgiveness turned out harder than I anticipated. I learned that it's not an instant gesture. Forgiveness is a process built step by step, and I decided I wouldn't force myself. I won't forgive for his sake, won't forgive to relieve his guilt. I want to forgive for myself, to stop being a prisoner of the past, to stop holding torment that hindered living. One evening, I met Father again. We went to the park where he once took me for walks. He said little, but each phrase was imbued with honesty. We were silent for hours, watching passers-by, birds, falling leaves. And in this silence, I felt for the first time that I could be around him without breaking, without fearing the torment that might return. He shared his life after leaving, about how he suffered, how he tried to find meaning, how he erred and rose again. I listened, and each narrative slowly softened my internal barrier that I'd built for so many years. I realized that people can err but can also change, and if he could change, then I can change my approach to the past. I began to realize that meeting Father doesn't cancel my childhood and teenage years. They were what they were, with all the torment, fears, and rage. But now I could look at them differently, as part of myself, as lessons that made me stronger, as experience that helped me learn to attach, believe, and let go. This reevaluation of the past wasn't easy. I often recalled episodes when I wanted to drop everything and roar. "Why did you leave?" I pictured scenes where I ask all the riddles, curse him, reproach him. But now I understood that these scenes were no longer needed. I can talk to him calmly, pour out my feelings, discuss torment without becoming a hostage to emotions. We began discussing the possibility of continuing contact. I didn't want to immediately build connections that would resemble the family it could have been. I wanted small steps, meetings, conversations, joint walks, and he agreed. He understood that time is needed for trust to grow, for torment to weaken, for our connections to be built on honesty and respect. In these days, I realized another key aspect. The past can't be changed, but the attitude toward it can. I began noticing that I no longer feel overwhelming anger, that I can recall childhood without an instant feeling of betrayal. I realized that I can build a life with the awareness that mistakes are part of people, part of the world, part of myself. Forgiveness, comprehension, and understanding of the past became for me not only a personal gesture, but also a chance to rethink my connections with other people. I became more attentive to friends, to companions, to mom. I began to value moments of presence, care, sincerity. And although the meeting with father was the central event, it gave me much more. A lesson about human nature, about the power of attachment, about the importance of honesty with oneself. This reevaluation of the past allowed me to see the future differently. I realized that I can make decisions based not on rage and bitterness, but on understanding and the possibility to act. I can learn to believe, can build connections, can attach. And most importantly, I can be a mature person who understands that the past shapes but doesn't dictate you. With each day, I noticed how internal tension receded, how torment gradually turned into memory, and memory into a lesson. I became less likely to return to thoughts of why did he leave, and more often thought about how we can live further, how we can build exchange, how we can create moments that won't be overshadowed by the past. The internal conflict gradually turned into peace. I no longer felt like a prisoner of my bitterness. I allowed myself to be myself, allowed myself to look at father as a person with flaws, as a person who made mistakes but who is now around. And this gave a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced for many years. I began to understand that meeting father isn't the end of the narrative, but its beginning. The beginning of a path that we will walk together cautiously, step by step. A path that requires endurance, honesty, understanding, and readiness to admit mistakes. A path that can lead to new connections, even if different from those possible in childhood. This reevaluation of the past became for me not only emotional liberation, but also the foundation for a new life. I realized that I can be strong, that I can attach and believe, that I can build connections with understanding, that I can let go for myself. And most importantly, I realized that the past shouldn't be a prison, it can become a key to the future. After that day in the bistro and subsequent exchanges, my life began to transform, although outwardly no one noticed. I went to work, met with friends, did routine things. But inside, everything was different. Something collapsed, and something began to be built anew. I realized that meeting father isn't the finale, but the start of a new chapter. The first weeks after the meeting were unusual. I caught myself checking the device, hoping to get a message from him. Sometimes it was simple. "How was your day?" Sometimes it was lengthy messages where he shared his thoughts, fears, experiences. Each word made my heart pound, each message. A reminder that he is now around, that exchange is possible. We began meeting more often. At first, these were short walks in the park, joint meals, conversations over a cup. He said little but sincerely, openly. I learned to listen without interrupting, without reproaching. Learned to accept him as he is now, not as he was 20 years ago. These meetings changed me. I became more attentive to my emotions, to the feelings of other people. I began noticing that I can attach without horror, that trust doesn't necessarily break, that connections can be built step by step. And although sometimes a feeling of torment and distrust arose in my chest, it was no longer the center of my inner world. Mom noticed the changes earlier than anyone. She said, "You've become different. You've become gentler, more peaceful." And I realized she was right. The realization that I can build exchange with father allowed me to be more open and sincere with loved ones. I began talking more with mom, sharing emotions I was once ashamed of. With father, we began discussing the past without roaring and reproaches. We shared with each other about our childhood fears, losses, regrets. Sometimes we were silent together, but this silence was no longer oppressive. It became cozy, like the warm presence next to someone who understands you without words. At first, it was hard to get used to the new dynamic. Sometimes I caught myself internally testing him. Won't he leave again? But gradually I realized that he had changed, that he is here and now, that he is ready to be around. And most importantly, that I am ready to accept it. We began doing small things together, visits to exhibitions, walks in the park, rare weekend trips. These moments were simple but meaningful. For the first time in many years, I felt that Father's presence could be bliss, not just torment. And every time he laughed or said something caring, I realized the past didn't ruin the possibility of the present. These meetings affected my personal sphere, too. I began building connections with people more openly. I learned that I can believe, that I can be vulnerable without horror, that attachment doesn't necessarily lead to torment. The past no longer dictated my actions, no longer shackled my emotions. With Father, we discussed difficult moments too, conflicts that could flare up, differences in nature, misunderstandings. But now we learned to talk about it calmly, without roaring and reproaches. We learned to hear each other, which turned out more important than all words of forgiveness. After a few months, I began noticing how my inner world transformed. The anxiety that lived in me for years decreased. I stopped scrolling endless scenes of bitterness and rage in my mind. I began looking at him as a separate person with flaws and virtues, as a person who went his path and now tries to build a new one. We began planning joint trips, small journeys, meetings with friends and relatives. I saw how he tries to be attentive, caring, sincere. And I felt that I can allow myself to be around without fearing that everything will collapse. Parallel to this, I realized that internal reconciliation isn't an instant gesture but a process. I learned to let go of the remnants of rage, to look at the past as a lesson, not as a catastrophe. And this gave a sense of freedom. Freedom to be myself, free from bitterness, free from the past that held me captive for so long. My life over these months became more saturated. I saw the world differently, more joys, fewer fears, more chances to build connections. I became more enduring, more attentive to people, to myself. And every time I saw Father around, I felt that part of my soul, left empty for so many years, begins to fill. We didn't build illusions. We understood that we can't return the past, can't fix all mistakes. But we could build the present and look to the future with understanding and respect. And this understanding became key. I realized that life with Father is possible, but it's different. It requires efforts, honesty, and openness. It requires readiness to admit mistakes, readiness to hear and accept, and most importantly, readiness to build connections that rely not on the past but on who we are now. The past was no longer a prison. It became a lesson that gave me strength and understanding that attachment and trust are possible, even if they weren't before. I realized that I can attach and be loved, that I can build connections with people without fearing torment, and that I can look at Father not as a betrayer but as a person who was around when he could be and is now ready to be around again. And in this discovery I found peace, the peace I'd been searching for so long, peace that allowed me to be a mature person, free from rage, from bitterness, and from past traumas. Peace that gave me a chance to build life as I wish, sincerely, openly, with attachment and understanding. This new life wasn't perfect. There were moments of doubt, anxiety, memories that suddenly returned. But now I knew I could cope, that I can accept, that I can build connections with the person who once left and with myself. And most importantly, I realized that meeting Father gave me more than I ever anticipated. It gave me a chance to be myself, a chance to live in the present, a chance to attach and believe. And in this, I found meaning and energy for the next chapter of my life.